The studio lights were bright enough to make anyone squint, and when the host called for a volunteer from the audience, most people shrank in their seats. But an elderly woman sitting near the middle row wasn't quick enough to look away. The camera caught her gentle face, framed with soft gray hair, and in that moment, the host pointed toward her with a playful grin that wasn't entirely kind. "Let's bring her up. She looks like she's got a fun surprise for us," he said loudly, and the audience laughed, not because they knew her, but because they expected something silly was about to happen. The woman's heart fluttered in her chest. She didn't like attention, and she definitely didn't like being put on the spot. But she also didn't want to cause trouble or say no. So she slowly got up, holding her small purse close, and started making her way down the stairs toward the stage. The host walked toward her with exaggerated excitement, encouraging the crowd to cheer. She tried to smile politely, but inside she felt uneasy. She didn't know what they wanted her to do yet. She just hoped it wasn't something humiliating. When she reached the stage, she stood quietly, her hands gently folded together. The host leaned toward her with a microphone and asked her name. She told him softly, and he repeated it loudly to the audience, dragging out the syllables in a playful way that made people chuckle again. "So," he said, turning back to her, "we do a little fun game on this show. We call someone from the audience and let them try something on stage. It's all for laughs, of course." He winked at the camera, then looked back at her. "How about you play a little tune on the piano for us? Just a few notes. Nothing complicated." He pointed toward a grand piano sitting under a spotlight. It looked polished, impressive, and intimidating. The woman's throat tightened. She hadn't touched a piano in years, not publicly. At least, and she could already sense the audience's expectation that she would stumble or press the wrong keys. Somewhere in the crowd, she heard snickering. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. People whispered, guessing she probably didn't know anything about music, imagining her hitting random keys while everyone laughed. The host pretended to be encouraging, but his smile wasn't warm. "Come on, just have a little fun. We love surprises on this show." She took a slow breath. She didn't feel insulted so much as uncomfortable. She knew they weren't asking her because they believed she could really play. They just wanted a moment that would entertain the audience at her expense, but she didn't want to appear rude or uncooperative. She had always lived quietly, politely, and she wasn't about to argue now. So she nodded faintly and took a small step toward the piano. The studio felt bigger from the stage. So many eyes, so many lights, so many cameras pointed at her. She walked slowly, carefully, trying not to trip or look uncertain, but each step felt heavy. She could hear her own breath louder than the applause. When she reached the piano bench, she paused. Her hand touched the smooth surface of the instrument, and something stirred inside her, something she had buried long ago. She remembered a much younger version of herself, sitting at a different piano, in a quieter place, playing melodies that once filled her life with purpose. But that was a long time ago. She sat down gently. Her knees weren't as strong as they used to be, so she lowered herself with care. She placed her purse beside her on the floor and looked at the keys. They gleamed under the bright lights, almost as if waiting for her. Behind her, the host whispered loudly to the audience, "This should be interesting," and laughter rolled across the room again. She heard every sound. She felt every assumption they had made about her. She placed her fingers above the keys, but she didn't press anything yet. Her hands trembled not from fear of the piano, but from the pressure of all the attention. She wished for a moment that the room would disappear, that she could be somewhere quiet, where music didn't feel like a performance, but a gentle part of life. Instead, she took another deep breath. The smell of the polished wood, the familiar touch of the keys, it all brought back distant memories. Her husband's voice came to mind, warm and supportive, telling her she had the hands of an artist. She blinked softly, steadying her breathing. The host walked closer, hovering just behind her shoulder. "Anytime you're ready," he said dramatically, as if expecting a comedic moment. She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed on the keys, trying to find confidence within herself. The audience waited, leaning forward, some with amused smiles, others ready to record the moment with their phones. She lifted her hands slightly, then rested them down again. Her fingers felt stiff, but not unfamiliar with the territory. She wanted to calm her nerves first. She wanted to remember the feeling of playing, not for entertainment, not for applause, but because it had once felt like home. The studio felt too loud, too bright, too expectant. She could hear people shifting in their seats, whispering, waiting. Some were impatient, some were curious, and some were already predicting failure. But she stayed still for a few seconds longer. She tried to gather herself, to settle the tremor in her hands and the racing in her heart. She knew that no matter what she played, even if it was simple, it had to come from a place she recognized. She glanced briefly at the audience. The faces blurred under the lights, but she could still feel their attention like a weight. She wasn't used to this. She had spent so much of her life in the background, quietly, privately, taking care of things no one else saw. And now here she was, on a brightly lit stage, being expected to provide a moment of entertainment. She lowered her eyes again. One key at a time, one breath at a time. Her right hand hovered over the middle keys, and for a moment she thought she might just press a single note and leave. That would be enough for them. Enough to get their laugh and move on. But something inside her disagreed. Something old. Something she had nearly forgotten she still had. Her fingers gently touched the first key, not pressing, just resting. And in that small contact, she felt the echo of who she used to be. She wasn't ready to play yet. But she wasn't as afraid now. She could feel the music within her, like a memory waking up slowly. Behind her, the host cleared his throat, trying to keep the moment entertaining. "Take your time," he said with a joking tone. "We're all very excited to hear your masterpiece." Laughter followed again. She didn't react. She didn't let the laughter reach her heart. Instead, she straightened her back slightly, as if remembering an old habit from her youth. When she used to practice for hours with perfect posture, her left hand settled over the lower keys. Her right hand floated above the higher ones. She finally exhaled deeply, letting go of the tension she had been holding since they called her name. She still hadn't played a single note, but something in the room began to shift. The audience, though still amused, grew quieter. They could sense she was taking this seriously, even if they didn't understand why. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, blocking out the lights and the faces and the whispers. She let herself imagine she was somewhere else, somewhere peaceful, where no one judged her, where no one expected a performance. She remembered the first time she ever touched a piano, long before her hair turned gray, long before her hands grew frail. She remembered the joy, the freedom, the feeling that music wasn't sound, but emotion poured into movement. And slowly, without realizing she had done it, her trembling stopped. She opened her eyes again, calm now, focused, and though she still hadn't played. The audience began to lean in, curious in a different way. The host waited. The cameras waited. Everyone waited. Her fingers hovered, steady this time. The moment before the first note felt like the quiet before a storm, except no one in that room had any idea what the next moment would change. The room stayed silent as she sat at the piano, her fingers hovering gently above the keys. Even though she had not yet played a single note, something about her stillness carried weight. It wasn't fear anymore. It was memory. Quiet, deep memory. She could feel the past reaching for her, the way an old friend might take your hand after many years. The stage, the lights, the waiting crowd, none of it existed for a moment. Only the piano did, only the soft hum of the air around her, only the familiar shape of something she once loved. But there was another feeling mixed with it too, hesitation. She had left this world behind decades ago. She had not abandoned music because she stopped loving it. She had abandoned it because life had demanded something else from her. She closed her eyes again, not because she wanted to block out the crowd, but because she wanted to go back in time. Far back, before the lines on her face, before the weight in her heart, before quiet afternoons turned into quiet years. She remembered sitting in a small room many years ago, a younger version of herself, practicing endlessly, chasing perfection with the determination only youth can carry. She remembered the excitement of learning new pieces, the confidence she once had, the pride of people who believed in her. And then she remembered the moment when everything changed. It wasn't the big dramatic moment people like to imagine. It wasn't a sudden disaster or some loud decision. It was a slow shift, a gentle turning of life's tide. Her husband had fallen sick, and the world around her grew smaller, quieter, more fragile. Music didn't disappear, it simply became something she placed aside, like a precious object she didn't want to damage. Her life became about caring for him. Day after day, year after year. She did it willingly, lovingly. She had promised to stand by him, and she did. But in the process, the piano fell silent. Not because she wanted it to, but because she no longer had the space inside her for both the responsibility and the music. And when he passed away, the silence remained. She opened her eyes slowly, returning to the bright studio. None of the people watching her knew any of this. To them, she was just an old woman picked for a joke. They didn't know the music she once held in her hands. They didn't know the reasons she had stopped. They didn't know the life she had lived. She took another breath, gentle but steady. Behind her, the host shifted his weight impatiently, still trying to keep the atmosphere light. He didn't understand why she was taking so long. The audience murmured quietly, waiting, expecting either something funny or something awkward. The woman didn't move yet. She looked at the keys again, almost as if studying them for the first time. It wasn't that she had forgotten how to play. It was that she hadn't touched a piano in so long that she wasn't sure if it would feel like home or like a stranger. Her fingers trembled again, but not from fear this time, more from the energy of a memory. Waking inside her, she slowly lifted her right hand and placed it softly on a single key. She didn't press it. She just let her finger rest there, feeling its cool surface. A quiet breath escaped her lips. She remembered the sound of that note. She remembered how it used to connect to others, how it formed melodies she once played with ease. She moved her left hand next, placing it over the lower keys. Her posture changed slightly as she did so. Her back straightened just a little. Her shoulders relaxed. The smallest shift, but enough to show something inside her was unlocking. A few people in the audience noticed the change. They weren't sure what it meant, but it made them pay closer attention. She wasn't the timid, hesitant woman who had walked up to the stage minutes earlier. Something was stirring under the surface, something old, something brave. She looked down at her hands. They were older now, thinner, lined with age. But they were the same hands that had once played with passion. Hands that had once told stories through sound. As she sat there, memories began returning, more clearly familiar rooms, soft applause, warm encouragement. She remembered playing for small crowds, long before life had taken her in a different direction. She remembered how people would close their eyes when she played, letting the music carry them somewhere soft. And she remembered him, her husband, sitting in the corner of the room, smiling every time she touched the keys. His smile had been enough to make any room feel bright. Even now, She could almost feel him beside her dot. Her heart ached softly at the memory. It wasn't painful in the way tears are painful. It was the kind of ache that comes from remembering something beautiful. That time has covered in dust. She blinked slowly, returning to the present once again. The studio lights reflected off the piano, creating a shimmer across the keys. She didn't understand why the show had chosen her. She didn't know why she had agreed to come up. But now that she was here, she felt something she had not felt in decades. A quiet invitation from the piano. A pull toward a part of herself she had forgotten, she missed. She shifted slightly on the bench, settling in more comfortably. The audience noticed again. Some leaned forward. Others silenced their whispers. Something about the way she moved now felt different. Purposeful Dot, the host, realized it too. His smile wavered. He took a small step back, unsure if this moment was still something he could turn into a joke. The woman breathed in slowly, letting her chest rise and fall as if preparing for something important. Her fingers curled slightly. Ready? Still, she didn't press any keys yet. She wasn't rushing. She couldn't. Music had always been more than sound to her. It had been a way of speaking without words. And after so many silent years, she wanted to approach it with care. She looked around the studio again, not nervously this time, but thoughtfully. She saw faces she didn't recognize, people who didn't know her story. She saw cameras capturing every moment. She saw lights that made everything feel bright and unreal. And yet, in all that brightness, she felt a calm growing inside her. She lifted her hands again and gently placed them into position, forming the shape she had once used when starting a familiar piece. Her fingers curved in a way they hadn't in years. The posture felt natural, almost instinctive. A few people in the audience exchanged quiet looks. They could tell something meaningful was about to happen, even if they didn't know what. The woman didn't think about impressing anyone. She wasn't thinking about the cameras or the host or the laughter she had heard earlier. She was thinking about the young girl she once was. The girl who played because she loved it. The girl who believed sound could be its own kind of light. She wanted to find that girl again. She closed her eyes for just a moment, as if asking the past for permission. Then she opened them, calm and steady. Her fingers gently shifted, aligning perfectly with the pattern she remembered from long ago. She still hadn't played the first note, but inside her, the music had already begun to wake. The audience leaned in even more. The host stepped aside. The camera zoomed closer. Everyone waited Dot, and for the first time since she had walked onto the stage, the woman felt ready. The hall slowly fell silent as the young girl moved closer to the piano, though she wasn't sure if she should even touch it again. After what had happened earlier, when the director shouted at the poor fellow janitor and humiliated him in front of everyone, she didn't want to draw any more attention. But something inside her didn't let her walk away either. She felt a strange pull, as if the piano itself was calling her. It was a quiet moment, but it carried a weight that even she didn't fully understand. She looked around. The director had stepped out of the room to speak with someone on a call. The performers were scattered across the hall, either chatting or practicing small pieces. No one seemed to be watching her, and yet she felt as if the room itself was waiting for something to happen. Her father, still standing by the corner with his cleaning tools, gave her a soft nod. His face said everything. If you want to, go ahead. I'm right here. That small reassurance was all she needed. With a deep breath, she placed her fingers onto the keys. At first, she didn't press them. She just let her fingertips rest there. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden wave of emotions rising inside her. Memories of her father humming tunes while working late nights. Memories of old piano recordings she'd secretly listened to with broken headphones. Memories of a small keyboard someone had once thrown away, and her father had fixed for her. All of it filled her chest. Then, like a whisper at first, she pressed the first note. It rang through the hall, soft but clear. A few heads turned in her direction, but no one said anything. She continued, her fingers moving slowly, gently, as if she was trying to wake the piano from a long sleep. The melody was simple at first, but there was something warm about it, something honest. The hall began to shift. Conversations paused. The sound of shoes clicking against the floor stopped. Even the rustling papers from the music director's stand came to rest. Every note she played reached out and curled around the listeners like a soft blanket, but she didn't know any famous compositions. She had never learned from a real teacher. Everything she played came from her heart, shaped by the rhythm of life she had lived. Quiet mornings, long evenings waiting for her father to return from work, dreams she kept hidden because she knew her world didn't match them. Her fingers began to move faster. The melody grew brighter, blooming from soft whispers into confident waves. The hall echoed with her sound, clear, pure, and full of emotion. Something about the way she played made it feel as if she wasn't just pressing keys. She was telling a story, her story, and her father's. Across the hall, the janitor stood frozen. He had never seen his daughter play like this in such a place, in front of such people. Pride formed in his eyes, so strong he couldn't blink it away. He tried to wipe the corners of his eyes before anyone noticed, but a few drops still fell. A pair of performers sitting nearest to the piano exchanged looks of surprise. They weren't expecting to be moved by a child, especially not the daughter of the man who quietly swept floors and emptied trash bins every evening. But they couldn't deny what they were hearing. One of them whispered, "How is she doing that? It sounds like she's been trained for years." "Nobody plays like that by accident," another replied softly. The melody shifted again, becoming deeper, richer. Her fingers flew across the keys with a grace she didn't even know she had. Every rise and fall, every pause, every soft touch, it all came naturally, as if she was breathing through the piano. By now, the entire hall had fallen silent. No one spoke. No one moved. People turned their chairs. Some stood. Some leaned forward. Some just closed their eyes and listened. They didn't care where she came from, who she was, or what she was wearing. In that moment, all that mattered was the music she was creating. Then, at the back of the hall, the director returned. He didn't notice the silence at first, not until he heard the sound of the piano. He stopped mid-step, confused. When he realized who was playing, his eyes widened. Of all the people who could have touched that piano, she was the last one he expected to hear. But the expression that came over his face wasn't anger this time. It was disbelief, pure astonishment. He stepped closer, slowly, almost cautiously, as if approaching a wild bird that might fly away if startled. The closer he came, the clearer the music hit him. The melody flowed with such emotion, such storytelling, that it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. The performers noticed him, but they didn't dare interrupt the moment by acknowledging him. They simply watched him approach, wondering what he would do. The girl's eyes remained closed as she played. She wasn't aware of how many people were watching. She wasn't aware that the director who had earlier shouted at her father now stood just behind her. She was lost in the music, carried by it as if it were a river. Then, something unexpected happened. A quiet gasp echoed through the hall as she transitioned into a breathtaking run of notes so smooth, so seamless, it sounded like the piano itself was singing. The audience felt it too. Shoulders softened. Heartbeats slowed. The air felt lighter. The director's expression changed again. This time, it wasn't just surprise, it was a realization. He had misjudged her. Completely. The girl played on, unaware of the emotional storm forming behind her. She moved from soft ripples to powerful chords, from delicate whispers to a warm, rising melody that felt like sunlight spreading across a quiet morning. Her father took a small step forward, unable to hold himself back. He didn't want to interrupt, but he wanted her to see him when she finished. He wanted her to know he was there, cheering silently. As the final notes approached, her fingers slowed. The melody softened again, returning to the gentle calm it began with. One last note lingered in the air, long, soft, and full of meaning. When it faded, the hall remained silent, not because they didn't want to clap, because they couldn't. They hadn't yet returned to themselves. They were suspended in a last echo of the music, holding their breath. Then, as if realizing they were allowed to feel again, the applause erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't impressed applause. It was the kind of applause that bursts out from the heart, raw and unstoppable. A wave of sound filled the hall, rising higher and higher. People clapped, some cheered, some stood instantly. A few performers looked like they wanted to cry, but didn't know how to explain why. The girl opened her eyes, startled. She had expected maybe a frown, maybe confusion, maybe someone telling her she wasn't supposed to touch the piano. But instead, she found the entire room looking at her with awe. Her father rushed forward and put a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, and he smiled, proud, emotional, and speechless. The director stepped closer. The hall quieted again, waiting for what he would say. He took a breath, but before he spoke, the girl suddenly glanced down, nervous. She didn't know whether she was in trouble or being praised. The director opened his mouth, and the moment froze, hanging in the air like a final note, waiting to resolve. The question wasn't what he would say. The real question was what would happen next. She sat there for a moment, her fingers still gently resting on the keys, letting the last note fade into the air. The studio was so quiet that she could hear her own breathing. The lights felt warmer than before, softer somehow, as if even they were showing her respect now. For years she had avoided stages, avoided attention, avoided everything that reminded her of who she used to be. And yet here she was, playing again in front of strangers, who moments earlier had laughed at the idea of her even touching a piano. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys and placed them on her lap. The silence stretched on, thick and full of emotion, until someone in the audience let out a small gasp. Then another person clapped, then another, and suddenly the entire room was filled with applause, loud, endless, genuine applause. She blinked rapidly, unsure if this was real or if she was imagining it. The host had frozen near the edge of the stage. He had been ready to make another joke when she first sat down, ready to play it off as another silly moment for the cameras. But now he looked completely speechless. His usual wide grin had fallen off his face. He stared at her as if she had transformed into someone completely new. She didn't look at him long. She simply lowered her eyes politely, feeling no anger toward him, only relief that her playing had spoken louder than any insult. One of the judges, a woman known for being strict and rarely emotional, wiped at her eyes without trying to hide it. She looked genuinely moved, not as part of any performance for television, but from something deep and real. Another judge leaned forward, elbows on the table, as though he was trying to pull himself closer to the moment she had created. The cameramen who once whispered about her age now stood still, their cameras locked on her without shaking. Even they knew this moment was larger than a routine TV segment. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled slightly. Before she could worry about falling, one of the stage assistants rushed to help her. He didn't say a word. He simply offered his hand with a respectful nod. She accepted it gently, appreciating the quiet kindness. When she finally stood upright, the applause grew even louder. It washed over her like a warm wave. Her chest tightened, but in a good way, not from nerves this time. but from feeling seen again after so many years of living quietly in the background. The host finally snapped out of his shock and hurried toward her. But this time, his smile was nervous, almost shaky. He cleared his throat and held the microphone closer to her. "Mom." That was something truly special, he managed to say. His voice didn't carry the playful tone he used earlier. Now he sounded small, almost unsure. She nodded politely, but didn't say anything yet. She didn't want to ruin the atmosphere with unnecessary words. She just wanted to breathe and let the moment settle. Another wave of applause erupted behind her. People stood up, dozens of them, then hundreds. A full standing ovation. She had only seen such things happen for celebrated performers, not someone like her. Someone who had spent years taking care of her home, living quietly, and avoiding the spotlight. A quiet thought crossed her mind. She hadn't been applauded like this since she was young, since the days when music filled her life and hope filled her heart. A time before responsibilities had taken over. A time before she had chosen love over her dreams. A time before life became heavier, and yet the feeling came back to her now, warm and familiar. The strict judge leaned close to her microphone. "Ma'am," she said softly, "may I ask, how long has it been since you last performed like that?" She hesitated for a moment, then spoke in her gentle, slightly shaky voice. "It's been a very long time. Many years." The judge blinked as though trying to process that. It didn't sound like many years. It sounded like someone who never stopped. The old woman smiled softly. "I stopped playing for people," she said, "but I never stopped loving music." That sentence alone brought a hush over the entire room again. The host stepped back slightly, as though giving her more space. Even he seemed to understand that this moment wasn't about him or the show anymore. It was about her story, her strength, her quiet courage. She glanced toward the audience. She didn't see mocking faces anymore. She saw admiration, tenderness, and even a few tears. People who had laughed only minutes before now looked at her with softened eyes. The change was almost overwhelming. The lights dimmed a little as the director signaled a pause in filming. The studio crew began to whisper among themselves, and some even clapped quietly when they passed by her. For a moment, she wondered if maybe she had imagined the earlier insults. But no, she remembered them clearly. And she remembered how small they had made her feel. But now, she felt tall again. A young woman from the production team approached her with a gentle smile. "Would you like some water?" she asked. She nodded gratefully. Her throat felt dry, not from fear, but from the emotion of everything happening around her. As she took the small bottle, she noticed how carefully the young woman held it out, as though showing respect through even the smallest gesture. "You were amazing," the young woman whispered before stepping away. She didn't know what to reply, so she simply smiled. Nearby, the judges spoke quietly among themselves. She could hear bits of their conversation words, like remarkable, unexpected, talent, and heartfelt. She didn't need to hear the full sentences to understand what they meant. The host approached again, this time walking slowly, his expression more sincere. He scratched the back of his neck nervously before speaking. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I want to apologize for earlier. I didn't expect. Well, I didn't expect what you just did." She looked at him with calm, gentle eyes. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet understanding. "Sometimes," she said, "people expect the wrong things." He swallowed and nodded. "You're right. And I'm sorry." She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. His apology wasn't something she craved, but it was something she appreciated. The director shouted instructions from across the room, preparing the next part of the show. The atmosphere had changed completely. Everyone seemed more alert, more respectful, more mindful of the moment they had just witnessed Dot as she watched the crew adjust cameras and move equipment around. She felt a small tug in her chest, something fragile but hopeful. She realized that today had given her something she didn't know she needed, a reminder that she was still capable of touching hearts, of creating something meaningful. She walked a little closer to the edge of the stage, looking out at the audience. Some waved at her. Others placed their hands over their hearts. She nodded at them, returning their warmth in her own quiet way. She didn't know what the judges would say next. She didn't know what the show planned to do with her performance or how they would use it. But none of that mattered. What mattered was this moment standing here, feeling alive again, feeling like the music inside her still had a place in the world. Dot, as the applause finally softened into a gentle murmur. She took a deep breath and let it settle inside her. She was not the same woman who had walked to the piano trembling and nervous. She was someone stronger, someone rediscovered, and she felt ready for whatever came next. She stayed near the edge of the stage for a moment, letting the last of the whispers fade into soft murmurs around the studio. Even though the cameras were still being reset and people were moving around again, she could feel that something inside the room had changed. It wasn't loud anymore, not busy in the same way as before. It felt almost peaceful. It felt like everyone had taken a breath. They didn't know they were holding Dot as she stood there. A young technician approached her carefully. He seemed nervous, as though he wasn't sure if he should speak. But finally he said, "Ma'am, your playing reminded me of my grandmother. She used to play at night when she couldn't sleep. Thank you for that." She smiled softly. "I'm glad it meant something to you." He nodded quickly and went back to work, but he kept glancing over at her as if still thinking about the moment. She felt grateful for his words. Simple comments from strangers often held more meaning than long speeches. The judges were still talking quietly, and the host seemed unsure whether to come closer again. His usual confident energy had shifted into something gentler. She didn't rush him or anyone else. She simply waited, feeling a calmness she hadn't felt in years. When the director finally called everyone back to their positions, the lights brightened again. The audience settled into their seats. The room had regained some of its earlier structure, but not its earlier attitude. Now the atmosphere carried respect. The host took a deep breath and stepped forward, his expression serious but warm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we just witnessed something truly beautiful tonight." The audience responded with soft applause. He turned toward her, offering her a gentle nod before speaking again. "Mom, before we continue, I'd like to ask, what made you say yes to playing for us tonight?" She looked at the piano. For a moment, her mind drifted back to the quiet mornings when she would play alone at home. No cameras, no audience, just her and the instrument. Then she answered simply, "I didn't want to, at first. But something inside me said to try. Maybe I just missed the feeling." The audience murmured in agreement, touched by her honesty. One of the judges raised a hand slightly, signaling that she wanted to speak. "Your playing wasn't just skill," she said. "It was heart. It was life. I think everyone here felt that." A wave of emotion passed across the audience. A few people nodded. One older man in the front row wiped his eyes. The judge continued, "Sometimes people think talent fades with age. But you showed us today that true ability comes from experience, from everything a person has lived through." She looked down, humbled by the words. The host stepped forward again. "We want to ask something, if you don't mind," he said. "Would you play one more song for us?" The room instantly went quiet, as if everyone held their breath waiting for her response. She paused, not because she didn't want to, but because the request touched her deeply. Playing once had been an accident, a moment she didn't expect. Playing again felt like a choice. She turned toward the piano. The light reflected off its surface, and for a second she could see her younger self sitting there, full of dreams. She walked toward it slowly, her steps steady this time, not shaking like before. When she reached the bench, she sat down carefully and positioned her hands on her lap. She closed her eyes and took a slow, gentle breath. She didn't need to think about what song to play. She already knew. Her hands rose and rested lightly on the keys. Then she began. The melody was calm, like a warm sunrise. Soft notes filled the room, flowing smoothly from one to the next. It wasn't a loud piece, nor a complicated one. It was simple, honest, and full of emotion. A melody she used to play for her husband when he couldn't sleep. A melody she had played during quiet afternoons, during long nights, during moments when life felt too heavy. Now she played it for everyone in the room. As her fingers moved, something beautiful happened. The audience leaned in closer. The judges stopped taking notes or whispering. Even the camera seemed to go still. For those few minutes, she wasn't just an older woman on a TV show. She was a storyteller, a musician, a human being sharing a part of her heart. The notes rose softly, then dipped, then rose again. Her hands moved with a grace that didn't belong to her age. It belonged to her memories stronger than time. When she reached the final part of the song, her eyes glistened, though she held her emotions steady. The melody slowed, softened, and gently faded away. She lifted her hands from the keys. Once again, there was silence. This silence felt different. It felt like the entire room was holding her emotion with her. Then the applause came loud, overwhelming, powerful. People stood again. Some cried openly. Some clapped so hard, their hands must have hurt. The host, who had tried at the start to make a joke at her expense, now looked genuinely grateful. She stood slowly and bowed her head, her smile soft and humble. The judges began to speak, each one expressing their admiration. One of them said, "You reminded us tonight that talent doesn't disappear with age. It deepens, it grows." Another judge added, "You didn't just perform. You changed the energy of the entire room." The host approached her with a microphone again, but this time he didn't look like a performer. He looked like someone who had learned a lesson. "Ma'am, thank you. Truly, you've given us one of the most memorable moments this show has ever had." She nodded. "Music does that," she said gently. "It touches people." He smiled an honest smile this time. "Yes, and you touched all of us tonight." After the show ended, people approached her one by one, crew members, audience members, even the judges. They shared small words, thanks, memories of their own. She listened to each of them, grateful for every kind expression. As she prepared to leave the stage, she took one last look at the piano. She felt no sadness, no regret, only peace. The night had given her something unexpected. Not fame, not attention, but something far more important: confidence. She had spent so many years believing her time had passed, that her talent was something from her past, not her present. But now she knew better. As she walked toward the exit doors, using the small handrail for support, she heard someone from the crew call out, "We hope you come back again." She turned and smiled. "Maybe I will," she said softly. When she stepped outside, the cool night air brushed against her face. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed it in deeply. Then she walked forward, not with the slow, uncertain steps she had earlier that evening, but with a steady calmness. She felt lighter, she felt proud, and she felt, for the first time in many years, like the world had not forgotten her, but more importantly, she had not forgotten herself.